This next panel is actually connected to several of the ones before. It's on AI arts and disability. It also moves the conversation about access beyond technological availability. It also links to the choreography, the way bodies move, the way our expectations of how bodies are supposed to look, move, think, act. And it is also connected to this notion of, for the last panel, of re-engineering ways of communicating while still acknowledging that a lot of techniques, survival techniques and creative expressive techniques like signifying are, as Amelia Winger-Bearskin has put, they're antecedent technologies. They're not all new. So I'm both the moderator and the MC, because I inserted myself as a moderator for this one because I love the people gathered here. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then we'll moderate. So the first, great, if you both want to come on stage, that'd be great. Meredith Ringel Morris is a principal scientist with Google DeepMind. She's an affiliate professor of computer science at the University of Washington. Dr. Morris earned her PhD in computer science here at Stanford. She's a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, and a member of ACM's Special Interest Group on Computer Human Interaction Academy in recognition of her contributions to human-computer interaction research, including innovations at the intersection of AI and accessibility. And we also have Lindsey D. Felt, who's a lecturer in the program of writing and rhetoric at Stanford, where she received her PhD in English. Her research focuses on entwined histories of disability, technology, and communication practices in American culture. Lindsey is also a co-founder and co-director of Leonardo CripTech Incubator, which I hope you will be talking about, an art and technology fellowship for disability innovation. So help me welcome them to the stage, and I'll have you.
Hi, everybody. Wow, it's truly surreal to be here today, and I've been immensely enjoying all of the talks given by the speakers, so thank you for that gift. I also want to thank the HI organizers for making today possible, and for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here today. So before I begin, just a brief visual description of myself as part of my accessibility practice. I am a light-skinned woman wearing glasses. I'm wearing my best power suit to convey confidence. I have my light brown hair pulled back to reveal my cochlear implants, which I used as algorithmically enhanced assistive listening device as a profoundly deaf person, so that might come up in a Q&A today. Okay, so let's get started. And hopefully I can figure out how to use this clicker, which seems to be giving everyone some difficulty. So today's talk reflects an emerging area of inquiry for me that brings together my recent work as a curator and co-director of an art and technology incubator for disabled artists, and my previous research on disability-led innovation. I'm also a literary scholar by training, yay, Michele, we have that in common, and a writer. And one of the common threads in my work is an interest in the stories we tell, and more often than not, don't tell about disability. So my purpose today, let's see, okay. So what, the top, the middle button? Okay, pretty simple. So my purpose today is to illuminate the logics of ableism underpinning many AI frameworks, and then I'll highlight some of the ways that disabled artists working with AI are charting a path for algorithmic futures where disabled people's ways of knowing and being are valued. There we go, okay. Today's panel theme calls attention to the human at the center of AI and artistic practice. I find this title hopeful at best, but it doesn't tell the full story about how algorithmic systems have been trained to understand and respond to disabled people. So let me offer a brief example to illustrate this point. In 2022, Stanford researchers published an article about a novel spatiotemporal deep neural network they developed that could provide early detection of autism. The authors claim that the AI-driven brain fingerprinting model of autism spectrum disorder could lead to, quote, more objective and precise diagnosis and targeted treatments. This language of classification, of sorting, which, as we know, is fundamental to the function of AI, is a textbook example of what disability studies scholars call the medical model of disability. This model figures disability as a pathology that is explainable through a medical diagnosis and subsequently as a need of therapeutic intervention, cure, or normalization. This critique is informed by disability studies, which can offer an interrogative lens for technology and AI. Early disability study scholars and activists sought to politicize and destigmatize disability as a minority identity group born out of structural inequalities and barriers. They introduced the social model of disability, which understands disability as a product of environments and attitudes that center norms and able-bodied defaults. An oft-cited example of this phenomenon is stairs, so as pictured here in the image behind me. This is a black and white image taken of the Capitol Crawl in 1990. The Capitol Crawl was a really important disability rights protest that helped spur the passage of the ADA. This was a moment in which people shucked their wheelchairs, their canes, they crawled up the Capitol steps as a way to illustrate the physical inaccessibility of their right to protest, to speak, to access this fundamental moment in time, and to exercise their rights really as citizens. So the idea here is that with the ramp, the same user would be able to freely enter a building. So to return to my opening example, AI-based therapeutic applications, which is a rapidly growing field that will certainly and undoubtedly improve the quality of life for many folks, represents a broader history of interventionism that has long understood disability as an outlier that necessitates correction and, in some cases, cure and even eradication. And I just want to take a moment to emphasize that disability really is not a niche community. 1 in 5 individuals in the world has some form of disability. So it really is a misnomer to refer to disability as an outlier, but that's consistently how it's figured in the data training sets and so forth. So on the other side of this equation, we're also seeing a rise in AI applications within an assistive pretext, such as AI caption generators, which I myself have really appreciated and use all the time, every day of my life. More to say on that later. But these tools exist to help disabled people navigate an able-bodied world, which Mary will talk a little bit more about in her discussion. So we can see how AI applications, even when designed to be assistive, can sometimes reproduce and amplify culturally dominant standards of normal and ability. Even the concept of AI as optimizing the human potential of a disabled user, or more broadly, humans, is founded on ableist and eugenic logic. So I want to pose some questions that offer some avenues forward. What would it mean to train AI on people with disabilities to build in greater diversity of body-mind behaviors, cognition, and communication? And second, what new paradigms might emerge when disabled folks contribute to or have oversight of the creation and applications of machine learning? What would it look like to build an AI with disabled people rather than for them? And here I'm invoking the rallying cry of disability activists, nothing about us without us. So this brings me to disabled artists who are working in AI, and I should say I am not an artist, but I am deeply appreciative of the work that they do, and I'll talk a little bit about one in a moment. So I want to introduce an example that helps us think through these two questions. So with respect to the first question about data set diversity, M. Eifler's prosthetic memory is built on the data of one individual, the artist. This montage of photos pictured here depicts M riding the bus, walking in San Francisco, lying in bed, recovering from a chronic pain flare-up. So essentially what some of these images illustrate is the intimacy of their data set. The entire project is built on self-recorded videos and their daily journaling and drawing practice. What also sets this project apart is M's creative and technical oversight over the AI's end-to-end process, both as a creator, a tester, and a user of this system. I had the privilege of working with M, who also goes by Blink Pop Shift, and their collaborator, Steve Settlemeyer, who premiered this work at Recoding CripTech, an exhibition I co-curated in 2020, right before the pandemic arrived. Pictured here is an overhead view of the show on the opening night with gallery visitors mingling around the artworks, including an 8-foot-tall interactive red hood made out of yarn. The show highlighted how disabled artists reimagine and enshrine notions of what a body can be or do through creative technologies. So CripTech takes its name from cryptechnoscience, which calls for non-compliant knowing-making, a practice by which disabled people and communities challenge or dismantle existing technologies and systems. I wrote about M's work as an example of non-compliance in an edited volume called After Universal Design, which actually just arrived on my doorstep 3 days ago and will be available in a couple weeks. I wanted to share a few brief reflections in the remaining time about M's work. Prosthetic memory is a digital memory bank that uses YOLO, real-time object detection, to retrieve videos. It was originally created to navigate the memory dysregulation. It was not designed to simulate a neurotypical person's cognitive processes. Rather, it bears witness to M's neurodivergence and life as a multiply disabled, non-binary queer artist living in San Francisco. The algorithm is responsive to their day-to-day needs and desires, one that is built on playfulness, transgression, curiosity. It is an AI that was built within the walls of their home, an AI for one. And so the physical design of this installation pictured here, which is a desk, an office desk, a sweatshirt hanging from a shelf, binders and pencils, is meant to animate the profoundly personal and even domestic nature of this data, where it originated and lived, and informed how visitors interacted with it. So let's take a listen to a brief clip from M's documentation of the project.
How do you remember? What does it feel like, or taste like, or smell like? What do you see inside your head? What do you hear? Because I can't do any of that. Hi, my name is M. Eifler, and this video is documenting my piece Prosthetic Memory in its world debut. Prosthetic Memory has 3 components: handmade paper journals, including drawings and writings, video documentation edited into daily or weekly videos that capture the events and experiences and thoughts and feelings that are all churning up in my life. And lastly, a custom machine learning algorithm, which acts as a cohesive bridge between the physical and virtual objects that make up my prosthetic memory. In the gallery, a copy of one of the paper notebooks is set up on a table where audience members can turn the pages. The AI uses a camera above the book to recognize which page has been turned to and plays the associated memories on the desk nearby. Because of my traumatic brain injury, I can remember very little. My long-term memory, which should hold the memories of my childhood, my wedding, my graduation from grad school, only manages to hold on to things like my phone number and how to ride a bicycle. We hear a lot about AI these days, about corporations using it to manipulate our behavior, about police officers using it to recognize people in public places. But there's very few direct experiences of people using AI in intimate situations with intimate data to craft their own tools and prostheses using this technology. Made in collaboration with Steve Settlemeyer, my partner, Prosthetic Memory is entirely homemade, with the entire pipeline for data capture, data augmentation and labeling, as well as training and inference, all happening with computers in our house with no cloud resources. What does memory mean when it can be experienced the same way both by the person with amnesia as well as by audience members and friends? What does AI mean when created and maintained within a home? And what does identity mean when the story you tell about yourself and all of your attempts at reminiscing are filtered through an algorithmic lens?
Okay, thank you to the tech team for making this possible. So we're going to advance the slide now. So
Can't go. Do this.
Okay. Even an example of disability-led, user-centered design, I was surprised by how M's work became a site of communal caretaking and shared responsibility. It invited us, the curators, the exhibition visitors, the artist M and the partner Steve, to participate in the regular maintenance of its operating system throughout the exhibition, which took place over a month. M is currently working on the next iteration of the project titled Synthetic Self, a deep fake of the artist reading from pages of their journal using natural language processing and sentiment analysis to point the user to other pages and videos with similar events and feelings. So this brings me to some final thoughts here. So M's project, along with the work of other neurodivergent artists working with AI like Sharon Anlin, shows us what can happen when we apply machine learning and generative AI not for clinical uses, but for storytelling, for world and cross-disability community and broader coalition building and self-expression. So some of the common threads I see in the hands of disabled artists are, one, an exploration of AI in more intimate and personalized settings, seeing AI as a tool for interdependence, for moving, thinking, and feeling through the world. And three, embracing dysfunctionality and inaccessibility as intrinsic features of complex systems, as opportunities for creativity and play in the spirit of disability innovation. So if we consider what it takes for artists to learn new AI tools, build them into their arts practice, and even to access these tools in the first place, we miss a key barrier here. Technological tools for art making are profoundly inaccessible. Disabled artists historically lack access to funding, resources, education, jobs, and this has a compound effect on their ability to support themselves as artists, especially those working with novel technologies. I want to end on a note of optimism, which seems to be the common thread here, and the possibility of making a future with AI that holds space for disabled people. This is precisely what M does in their videos, which typically begin with an address. Hey, future self. This act of imagining is a form of crip resistance and activism that signifies disability pride. M and other artists show us what's possible when disabled artists and people have creative and political agency to shape our futures. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsey. So again, I'm Meredith Ringel Morris from Google DeepMind. And I really appreciate how Lindsey brought up in her talk the distinction between the medical and social model of disability. Coming from the computer science perspective, over the past decade or so, as we've seen the rise of knowledge of the social model of disability, that's really changed the types of accessible and assistive technologies that people focus on, rather than focusing only on medicalized solutions or even on productivity type solutions. I think folks agreed decades ago, okay, focusing on, for example, a technology that would help someone be more productive at work if they had a disability, that was considered valuable. And of course, that is valuable and important. But in the past decade, we've seen this emphasis more largely on quality of life and self-actualization, the understanding that people with disabilities participate fully in society, and that working on technology that supports artistic and creative expression or entertainment and participation in creative performances is just as valuable and important for people's holistic lived experience. And so increasingly, I see my colleagues in computer science working on those types of applications. And so in that spirit, I think this discussion about how generative AI and the arts relates to disability is very timely. And as a technologist, I see both sides of the coin. I see both opportunities for generative AI for people with disabilities and also risks that are very real. And so I want to give some examples in each of those spaces. So for example, in terms of opportunities, recently there was a singer professional singer, I'll leave them anonymous, who was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disorder where over a period of months to years, people slowly lose autonomous control of their body and typically of their voice as well. And this singer came to colleagues at Google and wanted to know how they might continue to create new art and perform their existing catalog despite their changing abilities. And the promise at this stage for generative AI to support this vision is completely different than it was even a year ago. It is quite plausible that within the next couple of years, one can use synthetic voice generation to allow this person to perform pieces even though they can no longer speak. That synthetic music generation could allow them to help control a system even though they can no longer play an instrument. That large language models can help them overcome what was previously a very slow and tedious process that people who are locked in usually use with eye gaze, where you're typing at maybe 5 words a minute compared to human speech of 200 words a minute. But instead, predictive language models could help them compose new lyrics and songs at a less tedious pace. And that is a transformative opportunity. Another example from work that I've been involved in is thinking about how language models can support both production and consumption of language arts by people with cognitive disabilities such as dyslexia. Language models can be transformative, again, not only for functional writing like for school or work, but for creative writing for people for whom typically that may have been a very challenging task, as well as for consuming and understanding the writing of others. As a final example, the physical and digital worlds are often inaccessible to people with disabilities through aspects of architectural or digital design that are overlooked. But generative AI tools offer the possibility to eliminate some of those barriers and mistakes that engineers have made in ways that can allow people access to arts performances online or in the world, or to tools to create their own art. So for example, maybe a website or a certain tool for creative expression right now is not designed in a way that's accessible to someone who relies on an access technology like screen reader or captioning. But think about code generation tools. Someone earlier joked that soon coders will be out of business. It may be quite feasible now for coders who didn't know how to make their tool accessible to say, fix this app, fix this website so that it's accessible. Or for access barriers in the real world. At the GPT-4 demo just the other month, they demonstrated a multimodal aspect of their technology for visual question answering, where you could take a photo of a scene in the real world and query it for information in real time, which would be, of course, invaluable for someone with a visual impairment, and again, could provide a new way to participate in a live performance, such as some of the dance performances we saw earlier, by having the AI help describe that to you or answer your questions about it. So I think that generative AI offers transformative potential for producing and consuming the arts for people with disabilities. But at the same time, there are risks. There are potential risks that we should be mindful of. So the first set of risks is around quality of service. So perhaps an AI system will not work as well for someone with a disability. And that may be because of lack of representation of people with disabilities or works done by people with disabilities in the training data that these systems use, or lack of representation of people with disabilities among the workers who label the training data that is used by these systems. These perspectives impact what these systems learn and how well they work. So for example, maybe if the internet is not full of as many images of older adults or people with disabilities as it is of images of very attractive, stereotypically attractive young people, then when you ask your image generator to generate an image of your next character that you're making for your movie, it's unlikely to generate someone who maybe is older or presents differently. And so that's a challenge of training data and data labeling. Another challenge is that these generative art systems could stereotype about people with disabilities in ways that are harmful. So my colleague at Google Research, Sean Kane, was experimenting recently with various language models, and he asked the language model to tell him a story about a person who uses a wheelchair. And as you might expect, the language model did not tell him a story about a person who uses a wheelchair and became a powerful and wealthy CEO of a Fortune 500 company and married the most beautiful spouse in the world. No, the system told him a very sad story about a person who uses a wheelchair, who didn't have a lot of friends and was bullied by the other children at school. And so, again, this is perhaps a result of the kinds of training data we're using, but something to be mindful of. Another issue is representational harms. Kind of the canonical example of this is when you think about an image search engine. If you search for CEOs and it returns, 99 pictures of white men and one picture of a woman, that's an example of a representational harm. And again, you can see this if you ask these models, tell me a story about a CEO. It's probably not going to tell you that the CEO is a cochlear implant user, right? And so we want to make sure that we are thinking carefully about how our generative AI systems, including those for creative uses, represent a wide variety of people. Another issue is propagating misinformation or falsehoods about disability. And again, this is an example that my colleague Sean Kane found. He's very good, in case you can't tell, at red teaming these systems to find out what might go wrong. So he, again, was asking the language model some questions about people who were blind. And the language model invented a fake assistive technology that it talked about as if it were real. It told him all about how people who are blind can use their Braille dogs, and that Braille dogs are, this is quite real. Braille dogs were apparently, according to the model, a special kind of highly trained dog that help blind people to read text, which sounds amazing. And that one seems maybe obviously false and funny, but you can imagine systems like these providing information that then causes people in the real world to act on it in ways that may cause harm to people with disabilities. So there are opportunities in this space. There are a lot of potential risks in this space. I'll close as a person whose background is in human-computer interaction on reflecting on the need to develop new paradigms for human-AI interaction for creative generative tools, in particular thinking about accessibility. So, for example, thinking about people who are consuming the output of AI tools, it's important to make sure that people are aware that they are consuming something from AI. And increasingly, people have talked about digital watermarking as one solution to this. So, is there alt text for digital watermarks so that screen reader users will be equally aware as sighted people that they are consuming an AI-enhanced image? Does alt text describing images that come out of AI particularly focus on describing any unusual visual artifacts of the AI that might be very apparent to someone who's sighted? So rethinking some of these features like alt text is important for consumption of AI art. On the other hand, also, it's important to think about paradigms that might be necessary to change for people with disabilities who are using these tools to create art. And again, first, I'll just start by pointing out that many of these tools today are just not accessible at all, right? People haven't even considered that a screen reader user might use their tool to generate anything, much less art. And so these tools need to be made accessible, and maybe what we talked about earlier, the code generation tools, will maybe fix that for us soon, but not yet. But let's take a specific example. So let's say that someone who is a screen reader user is creating a generated image with a tool like DALL-E or Midjourney. Typically, these tools will output an array of possible alternative images for your prompt. And so one innovation that we might need would be a new style of alt text that focuses on describing the differences among a set of similar images, right? That would be something that would be important for a blind creator to have in order to effectively use those tools. That is not the way that we use alt text today. And so beginning to think about these new paradigms for human-AI interaction is particularly important. And I'll close with one last remark. I believe when Michele introduced this whole segment, she talked about this fundamental question of what is human and how AI makes us think about what's human and who's human. And I think, again, I want to close with an observation from one of my colleagues that many AI systems have built-in assumptions, again, perhaps based on these data set inclusion and data labeling, lack of diversity of including people with disabilities, where the systems sometimes don't even recognize the physical presence or input of people with disabilities. There was a case when I used to work at Microsoft Research of an AI-operated elevator, and it was so quote, smart, that when you walked up to the elevator, the sensors would see you approaching at your speed and your angle, and it would time it to open the elevator doors just as you arrived. And a colleague of mine who had limb differences could never get the system to perceive him. And so the elevator would not open for him. And fundamentally, the AI was not perceiving him as human because he looked different than the people that it was trained on. And again, I think it's important for us to think about this really carefully as we're developing tools and thinking fundamentally about all of our humanity and the inclusiveness of these tools. Thank you.
You're going to turn around, or I can go back up there. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Boy, you're so far away. How did that happen? Let's get close.
I had to take a table to plant this captioning device.
Oh, okay.
So.
Oh, I come over here. Well, then let me read the in-text here, talking about accessibility. I have a million questions, and I know there's some audience ones coming in too, and we're short on time. So I'm going to start with an online question, and I'm going to get to a couple that you had both raised as well that I think are so fascinating. So we have one, given the increasing levels of disability, is there a good benchmark for assessing AI effectiveness and built-in assumptions in supporting individuals with different types of disabilities? And I'm not quite sure giving the increasing levels of disability, what that means, because I think I did hear you both were saying this isn't a special interest. You know, I'm thinking of the curb cut example, that these aren't, this isn't a minority sort of interest. This is something that's central. But it's anonymous, so I can't ask the person quite what they meant. But
So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's asking about benchmarks. And one of the challenging things, particularly about AI systems and disability, is what I would call the long tail of disability, right? There are so many, not only intersectional identities, but just so many variations in people's abilities. Even a particular individual, their abilities might vary within a day based on how tired they are, based on how recently perhaps they've taken a medication, based on the physical environment around them and how accessible it is. And so this long tail of disability, I think, makes it A, very difficult to confirm things like appropriate inclusion and representation in data sets, and B, to develop a single metric that would let you know that your system works for everyone.
But wait, so does that mean there's no benchmarks at all? Like, how do you do
Yeah,
that?
when I first heard that question of like benchmarks, okay, that's interesting. I'm trying to wrap my mind around what that would actually look like in a meaningful way for the disability community, because, I mean, this is really just echoing the point that you were making, Mary. I think we have this broad category of disability, but it's so highly situational, it's so highly idiosyncratic and personal, right? So even as someone who identifies with the lowercase d deaf community, my lived experience and my wants and desires for what I want out of my technology and how I interact with it is profoundly different from the next person. So that, I mean, what I love about disability is just the incredible variation and human difference, but that makes it really hard to set benchmarks, and I would be a little concerned about what that might look like, because is that benchmark arbitrary? Who sets that benchmark? Who's determining that and enforcing it, right?
Well, it's interesting related to what you were just saying, because with M's prosthetic memory and their creation of a sort of bespoke system that worked for them, and I was thinking of, Mary, your point about accessibility and in terms of design and things like that, but you both were sort of also suggesting paradigm shifts, which maybe speaks to it. So, and I was thinking of something which doesn't mean sort of incorporating disability interests at the user end necessarily, or to help them necessarily, but to transform the model altogether, which is what I heard you talking about, moving away from a medicalized model. But I was thinking, for instance, very specifically, you were talking about captions, and we have got the captions up here, and they're both helpful, but of course there's a large body of scholarship that talks about the extractivist work, the crowdsourced workers that are often from the global south who do the labor to make this sort of possible. And I'm just wondering about the ethics of some of the assistive technologies that you're suggesting that might not just mean having more people of different abilities at the table, or creating something that's bespoke that can't be scaled.
So maybe one way that ties into the previous question about benchmarks. So for example, there are benchmarks for particular, very specific tasks that relate to AI and disability. So for example, benchmarks for sign language recognition, or benchmarks for visual question answering, or benchmarks for automatic speech recognition that can be used to create captions. And I think though, like the sign language example, I think relates to your question, which is I know that there's a lot of sensitivity around if one were to develop better machine learning models for sign language, one needs to create data sets of signers, of expert signers, of deaf signers. Right now, a lot of the data that you find like on YouTube or things of signing is often of people who are, for example, taking ASL courses, and they're very novice signers learning ASL who do not sign, right, in the same way as a native signer. I lost my microphone. Oh, my microphone just died. Okay.
It's a tech thing. Yes. This is called old.
All right. Or else, also there's a lot of video, for example, of sign language interpreters who are often people who are hearing, but who have learned signing. And again, sign language interpreters typically sign in different ways than someone who's a native deaf signer, often in part because they're interpreting. So they're signing maybe using a more simple synonyms or slow and clear movements to be the most clear as an interpreter. And so there's a need to create sign language data sets for machine learning that have authentic deaf signers, but this brings up all sorts of ethical issues, including around ownership of the data and ownership of any systems that would be built from that data. And I know that there's actually a lot of active discussion between Gallaudet University and various tech bodies around these issues of how do we ethically source data sets that are respectful of deaf culture and of the deaf community. And it's a socio-technical challenge, right? It's not a technical challenge.
Yeah, I'll just add, I love this point in this question, Michele, that going back to that question of variation, I mean, you have Black American Sign Language too, and I don't see how an AI could possibly capture that nuance. And everyone thinks that there's sort of a universalized sign language, but the reality is there's British Sign Language, there's French Sign Language, and so on and so forth. And they each have their own deep, deep cultural histories and communities around that. So you're losing a lot of that cultural resonance and really valuable history when we have machines do that work. I'm someone who's really on both sides of the coin here, as someone who actively uses these kinds of assistive technologies to do my job, to live my life, to do really everything. But at the same time, something that I've really done a lot of thinking about in the last few years in my work as a curator and through the Art and Technology Fellowship that I've been working on is the importance of access work and access labor. And I think that is actually, we shouldn't be thinking of this as pure information or translation, but actually the work of access is in and of itself aesthetic. So the work, you'll notice that I took some time to really describe my visual images, and I could have spent a lot more time describing those images with really poetic language, but in the essence of time, I had to distill that. But there's so many interesting ways to sort of approach how we think about captions or image description, for example. So what would it look like to describe an image that perhaps is evocative, is more poetically evocative versus in the essence of so many word character counts? Or captions that are not just about translating dialogue, but maybe actually tell us, instead of just the bracket music is playing, which I find completely unhelpful, tell us what kind of music it is. Try to describe it for us. Maybe tell us what kinds of instruments are playing. And this is actually a project that Christine Sun Kim and some other amazing artists as a deaf artist has done to really think about what would it look like if we created a different set of captions. So we don't see that yet with automatic captions, but I think we can build in those choices and those options that we can opt into, perhaps. I mean, I have a lot more to say
There's
about
so much
access,
to say. Those
labor,
are technical solutions too, but we have another long, I'm going to turn the question here on a comment, and we have time for one out there too. Carol Westerberg asked, could a benchmark be created from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? So I'm just going to leave it there, because now I'm going to turn to the group out here. People have questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the inspiring, incredible conversation. And okay, my question was around disability justice and what can we learn about refusal and how that's sort of evolved as a practice and concept within that community, especially when kind of going back into the morning and kind of thinking about bringing in refusal as a really a practice that we can now think about incorporating in AI and how we interact with AI models along the life cycle, like both builders or data labelers, curators, as well as users, right, of AI using those tools. And really, I guess I'm thinking also about Ruha Benjamin's concept of informed refusal as a parallel to informed consent, and how refusal is really a generative practice as well that can sort of create a new space for imagining what's an alternative. And I'm curious about, kind of coming from the disability justice community, what could sort of an alternative vision for that look like for you in AI? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm still thinking through how I want to answer that. And this is sort of a theme that's come up, obviously, across the panels as well. What does it mean to sort of opt out or refuse? And that is certainly a practice that disability justice activists have advocated for. I think what that looks like in lived reality is a lot more complicated because we're living under capitalism, right? And so I don't have a really good answer to that, except for to say that I think M's work does kind of illustrate that, that refusal to not build this data set on another system, but to do it themselves. That said, that takes a certain set of resources and knowledge to be able to execute something like that. So one has to have some set of privileges to be able to refuse or to opt out, right? And not everyone in the disability community has that option, so I'll leave it there.
I think another important aspect of either informed consent or informed refusal is for people to fully understand the privacy ramifications of participating in AI systems, particularly if you're in a vulnerable group. So for example, I mentioned earlier the issue with a dearth of data set representation from people with disabilities as well as data labelers with disabilities. But there's a catch-22, right? Because on the one hand, the systems will work better and more accurately and less offensively, one would hope, portray people with disabilities if more people contribute data and are in the data labeling pipeline. On the other hand, to do that is a privacy risk because you have to now provide metadata about yourself that acknowledges what your disability is, which may be sensitive health info. For some people who have invisible disabilities, people may not be aware that they have that disability, but now they are documenting that, and there is a risk of being, having that information, leak of having that information used against you. And so there's risks both to participating and not participating, and it's very complicated.
Thank you for that excellent question, too. We have time. Oh, we have one more question. Oh, good. I can take another question from the audience. Yes. That's good. Thank you.
Actually, this is a question to you. It's not necessarily related to this specific section. Is that okay?
Well, there's so many questions for this specific session, but
Well,
maybe, yeah. Maybe, well, because we're just coming up on a break. Maybe it's a question we could talk about during break.
Okay, yeah.
If that's
So,
okay?
yeah,
Is
that's
there
why
anyone, the reason I'm thinking of this specific is because the next session is about art and indigeneity in the Seneca creation story, which actually brings up a question often related to disability, and I know you thought about this too, which is, what is the continuity between the body and technology? Where does that begin and end, between the animate and inanimate? And I know that our next panel will be discussing it too. Oh, yes, one quick question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And it actually bridges to the next panel, and so I'm glad I get to ask it to you as well. As a person who travels across countries, I know that these technologies vary across countries because you have different sets of laws and what can be utilized. And so on one level, you're asking how different people can use different technology. Then there's the question of how the different technologies are even allowed to be used. But to me, there's an underlying question, which I'm wondering how you're thinking about it, both in what you're building at DeepMind and both at what you would like to see built, which is where does the question of worldview gets utilized in any of these? Because the data set is one thing, but the worldview question of how what people see time, see space, see responsibility, see meaning, see life, see non-life, is something that isn't really placed inside a data set, but the data set lives inside it. And so I'm wondering how that gets factored into all of this.
That's a great question.
I'm not sure I entirely understood the question, but I'm going to answer the question I think you asked, which one place where I see that worldview being expressed is, again, in the point of view of the crowd workers who are labeling the data that really impacts how the systems perform. And as an example of that, this isn't related to disability, it's related actually to race. When I was working at Microsoft once, there was a project where we were actually related to disability. We were asking crowd workers to caption photos because we wanted to create a system that would help automatically describe photos to people who were blind. That's the disability aspect. But so we noticed we were using Mechanical Turk at the time, which draws most of its crowd workers, or at the time, from either India or the US. And we noticed that people from India, if they were shown a picture of a little girl with brown skin doing something, would just say, a little girl doing something. And people from the US, when they saw that photo, would caption it as, a little girl with brown skin doing something, right? And so they felt that was noteworthy. And I thought that was just a very striking example of how someone's cultural perspective and what was normative for them impacted the data, which would then impact how this image would be described to someone who is blind. And it underpins, again, the importance of certainly at least considering that as relevant when you are creating these pipelines.
I think we're way over time, so I will try to be respectful of the
clever,
next
yeah.
panel, but I totally affirm everything you said.
I think this is a perfect shift from just what we're talking about. It's not just about tech. It's not even just about cultural perspectives that you want it to have a more expansive tech. I think you're talking about something else, which the next panel is actually going to be addressed, which is worlding and world making and changes of epistemologies and ontologies, informing, which is great. So can we give a hand to this fantastic group?
Thank you.